Production funding for No Higher Honor was provided in part by a grant from the law firm of McGuire Woods. Whether assisting a Fortune 500 corporation or a startup company, McGuire Woods' objective is unwavering, a dedication to client service that exceeds all expectations.
I, John Nichols Dalton.
I, John Nichols Dalton.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support the Constitution of the
John
United
Dalton
States.
fully embraced the new republicanism, which was much more conservative and which was indeed the future of Virginia's Republican Party. Linwood Holton was one of the founders of the Republican Party, but he was clearly more liberal than most Republicans were willing to admit to being at that time. Mills Godwin was a former conservative Byrd Organization Democrat. He had a hard time even saying the word Republican, given his history. Dalton was, of the three Republican governors of the 70s, the most Republican. He also, by winning the governorship, giving the Republicans a third straight victory, made it very clear that Republicans were here to stay, that it was the beginning of a new two-party trend in Virginia politics. Dalton was a transitional figure because he had ties to the old moderate Mountain Valley Republican Party of Linwood Holton. His father, Ted Dalton, had in fact helped to invent that party.
He was not John's biological father. John was Mary's nephew, and he came to live with them in the first grade. We were neighbors, so we got to know each other then, and a couple years later they officially adopted John and changed his name from John Nichols to John Dalton. And Ted's influence on him from then on, or even from the beginning, was, I think, immense. I used to go up to their house and play with John when we were youngsters, and Ted would always come in and say, "Now, Pete, what about your aunt so-and-so? What's her name, and where is she now, and is she registered to vote?" And so Ted was at this all the time, practically 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And obviously that influenced John. Ted could talk to a black tie state bar association one night, and the next day be out in his farm outfit with all the farmers sloshing around in the manure and feel right at home. And John picked that up and became that type of person. And then, of course, he drove for Ted in the 1953 and 1957 campaigns when he's running for governor.
The experience that John had working with his dad in 53 and 57 were educationally helpful to him. He recognized from those campaigns, if not from anything else, the importance of the individual voter, and his watchword all through every campaign that he ever participated in was precinct organization, block captains, every house. And somebody ought to go to every single one, and he learned that from Ted. He also learned how to shake hands from Ted. That sounds like a kind of a minor accomplishment, but I learned it from Ted. That hand was out all the time, and the importance of it was perfectly obvious if you watched Ted Dalton work a room or a shopping center or even a street scene.
So he had ties to the Holton moderates. At the same time, he was much more conservative than his father, and he was completely acceptable to the Byrd Organization and to the conservatives who were independents.
The Byrd machine had a philosophy. Unfortunately, to further the philosophy, it attempted to control those who supported the philosophy in the voting booth.
The candidates for governor and attorney general and lieutenant governor of the Republican Party prior to 1953 were token candidates. It was never a serious effort to elect statewide Republicans until 1953.
So when you were nominated, and you were in line to be nominated by the Byrd machine, then you were tantamount to governor. And you could set plans in July for your administration. And that was the Byrd machine.
Ted was a progressive person who grew up on repeal of the poll tax as a prerequisite to vote, for example. That was very progressive in that time. There were major efforts by organization people to do something that would substitute for the poll tax, which they recognized was going to be held unconstitutional. And there was a bill called the Camel Amendment, which was so complicated a Philadelphia lawyer couldn't fill it out. They'd give you a copy of the Constitution of Virginia and a blank piece of paper and say, okay, register. It was all the purpose to keep the electorate small. Ted was trying to open things up and bring more people, a diverse group, into the government. I think had Ted not done what he did in 1953, I would not have been elected in 1969. I think it showed people that, given the right circumstances, a Republican could overcome the Democratic tradition of Virginia and could win a statewide election. I think Ted would have won in 1957, except for the incidents at the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, when President Eisenhower had to send troops to enforce the human and civil rights of those kids to attend that school. But it created a backlash of public outcry and hostility that was unbelievable. And that's what kept Ted from winning in 1957.
So John was politically oriented, but I think his goal to run for governor came about in 1953 and again in 1957. It was just strengthened when Ted lost both of his races.
Now, I feel that this is $160-some thousand that our state can save without really decreasing any services that we render to the people of Virginia.
When the delegate seat opened up in that particular district, he ran and was elected. I think Ted had some influence in getting Jim Turk, their law partner, put on the federal bench. When that happened, it opened up a state Senate seat. John immediately moved into it and was elected. In the meantime, he kept contact with all the people that that were in the William & Mary Alumni Association, people that were in the University of Virginia Law School Association, the Masons, the other organizations that were statewide, and John moved up in them so that he was a leader in state civic organization, and he used that base when he ran for lieutenant governor and then governor.
I met John Dalton on a blind date. A friend asked me if I would be willing to go out with a handsome soldier, and I said yes.
John met his wife while he was in the service, and they actually got married without Ted and Mary knowing about it. And that sort of irritated Mary.
When you're young, you really don't think about anything other than the romance, and that's what happened. We eloped.
They really wanted to have John have a big wedding, and also wanted to marry a Southerner, somebody preferably from Radford, but that didn't happen. A tough situation for her to move into a small town society in southwest Virginia, being a Yankee, no less.
The Republican part of the Daltons and my family meshed perfectly. I mean, it was a joy. I know some families, they say, well, I'd sooner change my religion than my politics. That wasn't a problem. It worked for both of us.
And she adjusted very well and became a real asset for John in his races for lieutenant governor, well, all of his races, but in particular when he ran for lieutenant governor and for governor.
John's parents lived right next door to us, and that was the joy of my children's growing up. Ted Dalton, to my children, was always Big Ted because, of course, his grandson, our son, was Teddy. And so Big Ted was Big Ted. Actually, his wife was Big Mary because we had Little Mary.
By the time I came along, my grandfather was out of politics. And so I didn't, quite frankly, until I was probably a teenager or thereabouts, didn't realize that my grandfather had ever run for office. Or maybe I knew in the back of my mind, but I certainly didn't realize that he'd run for governor twice and what an impact he'd had on the rise of the Republican Party in Virginia.
It started so early. Mary was a little baby toddling around, and John decided to run for the House of Delegates. So we set up our dining room table, and we had cards for every voter in the district. We actually worked on it for months and months and months before he ever announced that he was going to run. That was John Dalton. He was a planner. He had things lined up beforehand, and it just so happened that it was convenient to do it at home.
So every house in the district, I knew who lived there, where they worked, how many children they had, the children's names, approximate age of the parents, and so I could go up to a door and knock on the door, and whoever came to the door, I'd have a pretty good idea of who I was talking to.
Dad started running for office when I was in second grade, so every other year from second grade on he would spend his summers campaigning door to door in the evenings after he finished his law practice. So we didn't see a lot of him the evenings of pre-election November. Throughout the summer he was gone most evenings and made it his priority to speak to every household in his district, and so we kind of missed him.
In the early campaigning, when you were in a small district, you needed a way to introduce yourself to the voter, and John found it convenient to take a potholder with him. And so he had them printed up. He had his name and the district and the date, and as he would go around, he would hand the voter the potholder. And when he would come up for re-election, guess what? They wanted to know, have you got a potholder this time? So it became a part of the campaign life.
I'm told of stories of my father campaigning with me as a baby. I mean, everybody knows the proverbial politician with a baby on his hip. Apparently they really did that with me, and so I was involved in, I guess, 4 House of Delegates races, his Senate race, his Lieutenant Governor's race, and finally the race for governor.
We were mostly allowed to continue to be, children and not pulled into the center. I got to make a few speeches and ride in a few parades in Denby and places I'd never heard of. And I was very supportive. We would have family photo shoots and the commercials and things like that.
I don't ever remember my father talking about wanting to be governor. It was, by the time he became lieutenant governor, sort of an unsaid thing, but I don't ever remember as a child his talking about, I have to be governor because my father attempted to do that and built the party so that I could do that. I don't remember any of that.
Kid's bread, but Mr. Moneybags doesn't pay a tax on his country club membership. You pay a tax on your
Henry Howell had been active in politics since 1949. He worked for all the anti-Byrd candidates. He'd gotten elected to the House of Delegates and the state Senate. He was opposed all the time by the Byrd people, but he beat them in the progressive port city of Norfolk. Henry Howell was the foremost liberal and progressive in Virginia in the 20th century. And beyond that, he was probably the most important populist in the entire South, very progressive on issues of race and consumerism and the like. The average guy, the little guy in the 60s and the 70s, was absolutely convinced that he or she was being ruined by the big powers, the big boys. And that's what Henry Howell ran against. His slogan, keep the big boys honest.
The rich man, but it's a constant burden for the man who works for his living, and I won't have it.
Keep the big boys honest. Let's make Henry Howell our governor.
Keeping the big boys honest, but there was never any description of who they were, except that it might have been at the time VEPCO, which is now Dominion Resources or Virginia Power. The big corporations in Virginia, who, not having been said directly, but by calling them big boys, there was an insinuation that was dishonesty, that was taking advantage of the poor in Virginia, and doing other untoward things that might enhance their wealth. None of this, of course, was true, but still it provided an illusion that big corporate structures were something other than in the business of fair play.
Now, he was never more acceptable to the establishment. They were very consistent. They hated him from the first day he got involved in 1949, and they continued to hate him all the way through to the end of his political career in 1977. So they convinced Attorney General Andrew P. Miller to run against Howell in the Democratic primary.
So we wanted to run against Henry Howell. We thought we would have a better chance, and so our whole message in the spring of '77 was to tell the Republicans and the conservatives across the state that the elections in November stay out of the Democratic primary.
I don't think there's any question but that the primary was key.
It was a very difficult primary from my perspective because what had happened to the Democratic Party in the years preceding the 77 primary. A great many people who consider themselves Democrats have been totally turned off by the Democratic Convention in '68, the McGovern candidacy in '72, and consequently decided that they weren't going to participate in the party processes anymore. By coming out to the primary, they were going to wait for the general election. So many people who consider themselves Democrats are no longer identified with the party. It made a primary contest much more challenging than would otherwise have been the case.
It's quite possible that had the primary been restricted to just Democrats, that Andy Miller would have beaten Henry Howell.
There was no question that the Republicans were involved. To what extent, nobody will ever know the answer.
A young fellow by the name of George Allen, who eventually became a Republican governor, went into that primary in 1977 and voted for Henry Howell. I don't normally think of George Allen as being a Henry Howell type of voter, but the Republicans knew that Howell would be a much riper target in November, that Miller would be much tougher to beat. Dalton might well have lost to Miller, but Howell was a ripe target.
Well, that sounds self-serving as to whether or not Henry Howell made the best candidate. I don't think the polls showed that. And certainly the ultimate outcome didn't show that. I think probably the best person to answer your question is probably those who've talked to Johnny Dalton about the campaign, and he certainly told me and others that he would have had a much more difficult time if the Democratic primary had turned out the other way. I had a great deal of respect for him. It would have been a tough race, but I think even he thought that it might not have turned out to his advantage. In the Republican headquarters in Richmond, there were precinct signs with Henry Howell's name on them. And when I heard that story, I knew I was going to be in serious trouble.
I think we would have had a good chance to win. What would have happened in that race is purely hypothetical, but certainly the campaign went according to the strategy we had planned from the very beginning.
Every analyst operating in Virginia in that day predicted that Miller would not only win, he would win in a landslide of probably 60-40 or better. Well, Henry Howell had a surprise. The Democratic Party primary turnout was 500,000. So it was a small group who turned out, labor, liberals, and African Americans. And they loved Henry Howell. And Henry Howell, against all the odds, having been outspent by a fortune, was nominated 52% to 48% and was set up for the general election campaign in 1977.
And I don't think that a majority of the people of Virginia are in favor of taking Virginia down a liberal course of government for the next 4 years, and I don't think they're going to vote that way on November the 8th.
I was covering Henry Howell, and he was great fun to cover. He was so flamboyant and so enthusiastic, and I remember driving through the streets of Newport News in this van that he had, and it would be 5:30 in the morning, and he would be blaring out over the intercom to the streets of Newport News, you know, "Wake up all you sleeping Newport News residents, Henry Howell is here." And so there was a lot of fun attached to it.
The election was about a combination of personality and issues, but whenever Henry Howell was in a campaign, the election was always about Henry Howell. He was a polarizer. People either loved him or they hated him. He was at the cutting edge. He was really too progressive for Virginia. Virginians are not averse to change, but they like their changes in small doses and a long period of time between each of the changes. Henry Howell wanted a lot of change all at once, and it was just too much.
Virginia's economy appears to me to face two immediate threats. One is from a gubernatorial candidate who has made a career of running down, whipping, badgering, and otherwise humiliating the Virginia business community. The other lives across the Potomac in Washington.
John Dalton's relations with the business community were solid. He was not from the Richmond Main Street business establishment, but the Republican Party was cultivating those ties, and the presence of Mills Godwin and that wing of the former Democratic Party that now was voting with Republicans gave him access to many of the movers and shakers in the Richmond business establishment. I think the fact that he was running against Henry Howell eliminated any doubts or concerns they might have had.
I did not meet John Dalton. I don't remember anything significant about his speeches. Our approach was to run for Henry Howell and what he stood for, not against John Dalton. John Dalton really wasn't the type of guy you really got mad at. I mean, he was lieutenant governor, a Republican. The way things went in Virginia is, you know, you go from lieutenant governor to governor.
When I first met the lieutenant governor, I thought he was confident, I thought he was positive, I thought he had a wonderful caring about Virginia. I thought he was youthful and vigorous, and I thought he was going to be a great leader. He really liked being out himself. He was very, very people-oriented. He enjoyed learning people's names. He enjoyed learning where they were from, what they were interested in, and he had a wonderful, warm connection with everybody. He was not stuffy. He was not pompous. He was very real.
He really first got out of the blocks with direct mail, identifying demographically what people had what push buttons and how to push those buttons to get money.
It was much more of an exciting campaign than bitter campaign. It was really quite a lot of fun.
It was an intense campaign. A lot of people say it was bitter. Political campaigns at that level strike me as divorces. None of them are very good, and people who say they're nice and pleasant and it's okay probably need to get checked.
The contrast between the two candidates were very clear, and in that sense, that makes an ideal campaign.
There wasn't animosity from our end towards John Dalton. The bitterness that came is that just over the course of time of my father being so independent and so outspoken in trying to get fair play in the political system, he was off on his own. People didn't like him, and people in power didn't like him, and people with money didn't like him. And they just did not like him. Many of them hated him. He was a butt of jokes. So because of what, it was just, he was so challenging and so in their face and so tenacious. Just, he would not give up. He would not go away.
I think the Dalton efforts were much more organized, not only in the area of media relations, but in every other aspect of the campaign.
The Dalton campaign pretty well had all of the latest techniques that were able to be used for polling, survey research, telephone banks, tracking. We did one benchmark survey, I think, right after the Democratic primary, and then we did some tracking right at the very end of the campaign, maybe the last week, 2 weeks. And it was a wonderful difference from the benchmark survey where Governor Dalton was behind Henry Howell to the tracking near the end of the campaign where he was clearly not only ahead but continuing to increase every day towards Election Day in his popularity.
Henry Howell was easy and fun to run against. He was mercurial. You knew you could set him off with the right comment. It was sort of like having your own punching bag.
He's costing insurance companies, banks, utility companies, C&P money all over the course of time. You know, so they're after him in '77. John Dalton probably could have stayed home from the time Dad beat Andy Miller to November election and still beaten my father. I think if people just looked at my father's issues and what he tried to accomplish, he would have gotten elected.
The problem was that he was running against a moderate, and that moderate had the strong support not just of the old Byrd organization, but of the more moderate elements in the Republican Party. Shortly after the primary in 1977, when Hal was on top of the world, having won when no one expected him to, he was already experiencing some doubts, and other people were doubting too. Could he win? He'd already lost twice. And he turned to me and he gave me a strange analogy. He said, you know, I almost beat the ultimate thoroughbred of Virginia politics, Mills Godwin, in 1973. Do you really think I can't beat a pony in 77? And of course I laughed and he laughed and everyone laughed because he was calling Dalton the pony, Hal the thoroughbred, and in some respects it was true. But of course Dalton was tabula rasa. He was the blank slate. He wasn't even known. He had no enemies. So it was incredibly easy for John Dalton to do what had been extremely difficult for Mills Godwin to do: unite all of Henry Howell's enemies. And he'd had enemies building up since 1949. We didn't see that then, and Henry Howell certainly didn't. But to this day, I remember that analogy and how easy it is for candidates to fool themselves. Howell was tremendously overconfident for reasons that none of us will ever be able to fully understand. Part of that overconfidence manifested itself in an unsubstantiated charge that Henry Howell made against John Dalton during the campaign of '77.
And the question in my mind is why John Dalton refuses to tell the people of Virginia what he has and how he earned it. It makes me wonder, and it makes the people of Virginia wonder, if Mr. Dalton really has something to hide.
He will not apologize. He won't tell us what he's talking about, but he keeps coming up with charges that have no truth to them.
Howell said that John Dalton had, quote, feathered his own nest, had done things to benefit his own financial interests during his time in public office. It was a devastating charge, potentially. It could have hurt John Dalton substantially. There was just one problem. There was no proof.
There was nothing to the charge. But after that, I decided I wasn't going to grace the stage with him anymore, and so I called off all further debates. I had I think, 12 or 14 joint appearances with him at that point, and I decided from there on I was going to run my campaign, and he'd have to run his. But we didn't see each other anymore during that campaign.
So at that point, things did become very bitter, and it became a much more hard-hitting campaign and a less pleasant campaign to cover.
It damaged Howell considerably and reminded people of what they didn't like about Henry Howell: the controversy, the negativity, the constant charges. And I believe from that point on, there was no chance that Henry Howell would win the election. Henry Howell was overconfident. The early polls, for the first time ever, showed Howell ahead by a wide margin. He was convinced he was governor-elect, and he made some foolish mistakes during the campaign and was defeated in a landslide. I met with Henry Howell on the day before the 1977 general election, and I was straining to find a way to suggest to him that an upset was possible. But I knew it wasn't true, and what I most remember is he knew it wasn't true. It was perhaps the saddest moment that I ever had in elective politics.
John Dalton enjoyed that race. It was a knockdown, drag-out. Had it not been Henry Howell, then the entire campaign strategy would have had to have been different. He was a feisty, political animal when it came to campaigning.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am tremendously proud of the victory we have obtained this evening. When we started this campaign some 200.
But once he was elected, a different John Dalton emerged from the metamorphosis overnight.
We set as one of our goals to bring together people of all political persuasions. People who had looked on themselves as Democrats, people who had been Republicans, people who were independent-minded, people who were conservative, moderate, and yes, some liberals. And we've done that tonight, and we're going to continue the good government that has been Virginia's for many years.
The inauguration was, of course, a big production. We were on the platform, and it was time for John to be sworn in. His father Judge Ted Dalton was going to be the person to swear him in. And Ted came up to do it. I was holding the Bible, and he hugged John. It was a warm relationship, but it was not the normal thing for them to hug. And I saw John's eyes fill with tears.
This was the culmination of Ted's dream.
I worried. I thought, well, will he be able to give the inaugural speech?
As a federal judge, he couldn't participate in the campaigns. He could still share the joy of his son's achievement.
So there was a space of a moment or so, and Ted went on and swore him in, and everybody was fine.
Well, the governor-elect hold up his right hand, place his left hand on the Holy Bible, and repeat after me the oath as is set forth in our Constitution. I, John Nichols Dalton.
I, John Nichols Dalton.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support the Constitution of the United States.
And the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
And the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
And that I will faithfully and impartially.
And that I will faithfully and impartially.
Discharge and perform.
Discharge and perform.
All the duties incumbent upon me.
All the duties incumbent upon me.
As Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
As Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
According to the best of my ability.
According to the best of my ability.
So help me God.
So help me God.
And when it was complete, they hugged, and you had to be close enough to see this, but he said, God bless you. This is so much more fulfillment of my dreams than it ever would have been had I been elected myself.
The people of Virginia still believe in the middle way, the way of moderation, of prudence, of reliance on time-tested principle. This is not to say that the people are content with everything the way it is, because they certainly are not. They're looking for continued progress and positive change, and all that they ask is that we, as their elected representatives, have the courage and the wisdom to select the most appropriate courses of action and lead them into a better tomorrow.
Governor Dalton had a real commitment to good government. He had a commitment to bipartisan leadership. He really made a distinction between what you have to do in a campaign, and that is a two-party system which is healthy and competitive and gets people to participate, gets voters to make a choice. And then when you're elected, turning statesman and changing the question then to what is in the best interest of Virginia, what is good for Virginians. And it was a constant question that he asked on many, many occasions throughout his term of office as governor.
One of the tough jobs he had was to increase the gas tax.
Totally unlike John to want to add taxes, but he thought that it was needed.
He faced the music head on. Had to be done, and it was good for Virginia.
The Dalton era coincided with the demise of the major coal activity in Southwest Virginia. It also coincided with the demand for coal worldwide. And a strike in the coal fields is pretty close to World War III for that portion of Virginia. Jack rocks are nails that are bent and welded together and thrown in the roadway and will tear up huge truck tires. And it got to that point of hostility. And John Dalton agreed to send in as much manpower as it took in the form of state police to get it under control, to break some heads, to do whatever it took to get it under control for the rest of the inhabitants.
He was very inclusive in the way that he thought in his party-building efforts and in his efforts as a statesman when he was governor. Not just to touch base with the obvious, but also go outside of the obvious and make sure you've got a full picture in your decision-making mode.
That's why his cabinet was made up of individuals who would disagree with John Dalton readily, without hesitation. He would hear the debate prior to the decision. He had the benefit of thoughts of those who disagreed, and he could move forward, plan strategy.
He was a great leader. He saw a problem, and he went about trying to solve that problem.
Then he'd surround himself with members of the General Assembly, the leadership, and he'd talk about it. He didn't name the time frame that it had to be done. He talked about it. He didn't put his finger to the wind and say, the people want this, so I'm going to do it. He attempted to stay ahead of that curve, and he was pretty successful at doing that.
Now, on issues, I think John saw the environment changing. He was influenced by the Obenchains and others and Godwins who saw the future of the Republican Party on the more conservative side. And by conservative on that, I mean tendency to go back to organization days. And John Dalton bought some of that, so he was leaning toward the coalition of conservatives as his future.
But we had to put together a comprehensive plan to desegregate our colleges and universities. He was interested in good management and advancing the state.
Some of those people that they were dancing with really wanted to dance back to the old days. In that context, conservative was, in effect, white supremacy.
John's role in the desegregation crisis, that came from his father. His father ran for governor twice, and at one point the troops went into Little Rock, and that election he lost that because he said, what the Supreme Court says is the law of the land, that's what we will follow. And John had that same attitude, so he was even-handed in the way he treated everybody.
Part of his campaign was to appoint an African American to every college board in Virginia. In his campaign, he said he would have an African American in the cabinet, and Dr. Gene Harris, head of the family practice program at the Medical College of Virginia, was Secretary of Health and Human Resources in his administration.
Dalton made some real gestures to the African American community, but on one that was really symbolic, which was the Martin Luther King holiday, he vetoed it. And I talked to Governor Dalton and urged him to sign that bill. He was non-committal to me. I viewed that as a signal that he was going to veto it. That pretty much rubbed out any favorable perception that the black community would have had of him.
John had a philosophy of government, and that is the less government, the better. I think one thing he wanted to do was control the size of government, because he realized that the taxpayers were going to have to foot the bill. He worked on that hard.
John Dalton was a matter-of-fact individual, and he set out a program to try to make government as efficient as you can make it, to have people focus on delivery of service, the best that we could do at the least cost. So that was his state agenda.
He had an overriding commitment to bringing new jobs to Virginia, and economic development was truly one of his hallmarks. That was a multifaceted approach to bringing jobs to Virginia. It was to make sure that we had the infrastructure that would attract companies into Virginia, our roads, our clean water treatment plants, our airports, our educational system, to make sure that the schools from primary all the way through college were going to be able to draw people in for their families. He wanted to make sure they were clean industries, they were going to be economically compatible with the conservation values of Virginia, and environmentally compatible with all of the environmental statutes under which we were operating. He wanted to make sure we had our right to work law as a clear policy direction for the state that would be supported and enforced, and he did. The result was quite positive. I believe that he ended up helping create some 32,000, 34,000 jobs over his 4-year term, and that's quite a lot.
John Dalton was very interested in building the Republican Party in Virginia. He did a good job of that. He was tenacious at it, but he recognized he was in a clear minority status with respect to the legislature. He had been a member of the General Assembly, and once you have been in that family, you're always in that family. So he had the ability to play both sides of the coin back to back. He could be on the campaign trail in the morning in a very partisan manner, as one would expect, and that afternoon he could be meeting with the Democratic leadership, discussing policy issues for the state, and it was pure business.
After the General Assembly session would end, the governor had 30 days to sign or veto some 800 pieces of legislation. And he was very meticulous about the kind of information that he wanted. He wanted input from the Attorney General's office to make sure the legislation was constitutional and had no legal flaws. He wanted input from the state agencies and cabinet secretaries who had something to do with that particular law being changed. He wanted input from the legislators who sponsored the legislation. He wanted to know what the opposition arguments were as well as the supportive arguments. So he had a great deal of input to be coordinated before he would take final action on the bill.
In terms of his governance and what he did with state government, I think frugality and fiscal prudence were the hallmarks of John Dalton's administration.
I don't know if it's still the case today, but in those days, sometimes the exact same bill would pass both houses, introduced by different sponsors. Both of those bills would have been signed into law by previous governors, and then when you actually amend the Code of Virginia, you would, of course, only amend it once. But Governor Dalton thought that was a waste of money because they both would have to be typeset and they would both have to be edited, and he thought, well, we're not going to do that, we'll just pick one. And I asked, well, how are we going to do that? And he said, well, we'll toss a coin.
The Dalton administration came at a time when technology was sort of on the brink. But TV today has become so much more of the medium you use to deliver your message. And back then, radio was one of the hot numbers you used.
We would write speeches, and in the case of the electronic side, I would pump out radio actualities around the state on a daily basis. We jury-rigged a telephone in the office that had exposed wires and stuff, but I would simply call 10 or 15 radio stations a day with a comment from Dalton, which is important because there are 1,000-watt radio stations scattered all across the countryside. And once they get a piece of tape, it's like a local newspaper. It continues to appear and air and be read forever, ad nauseum. So it was a great way to come in under the radar screen.
The era when reporters were part of the scene to the degree that they walked into the governor's office or that there were sort of these off-the-record briefings on a routine basis, that was really changing.
John Dalton didn't mind interacting with the press, and he did quite well, but he was never comfortable with it.
A lot of those things changed with Watergate. There was a different relationship between the press and the governor, and to a degree that may have been the result of Dalton's own personality, but to a degree it was also a result of the fact that there was a more aggressive press and people were asking the sorts of questions that they wouldn't have asked in the past. I don't think reporters really wanted the intimacy that had been prevalent in Virginia politics in a previous era.
It's an adversary position. I mean, it's supposed to be that way. They're supposed to report on everything.
They didn't want to be a friend of the governor. They wanted to observe the governor, and they wanted to report on what the governor was doing.
John was so smart about it. He took members of the press and put them in positions in the governor's office. It turned out to be a wonderful idea because they had insight into how it worked.
I don't think he fully comprehended the changing landscape, and it upset him on a number of occasions.
There was a change in the atmosphere between the press and politicians after the Nixon years.
And I think that a number of these things that he was questioned and challenged on would have been done, if not in that precise form, in similar forms by other governors, and never would have been questioned.
When he interacted with the media, to me there were some shades of the John Kennedy wit and style. He didn't mind sparring with the press.
For the first time, people were going over and looking through the records and seeing how much money was spent on flowers and how much money was spent on this detail and that detail. And if there was an unfairness to it, it was simply that these things had existed in the past and had not been reported before. Personal things that had to deal with Dalton's increased use of the state limousine, or the fact that he used state taxpayer funds to pay for the tent for his daughter's wedding. I think those stories drove him wild. I think it's probably true that previous governors were not held to a similar standard.
I think there are those who think that the criticism of the tent purchase was legitimate. I think a case can be made for that. Ostensibly purchased for the greater good and use of the mansion, but clearly associated with the daughter's wedding. And that rubbed people the wrong way. That was a misstep. And there was no way to explain it, no way to get the mud off the shoe completely after you'd stepped in the pothole.
This was a man who had made much of his being of his roots and coming from Western Virginia and being of the people. And these stories showed that there was an element of, I guess, a sense of noblesse oblige in a way, and that from a press standpoint, those were legitimate things to discuss and to point out.
I wanted to get him from time to time to go down to the press room in the Capitol on a periodic, regular basis, just to hang out in shirt sleeves and sit down and chew the fat and befriend members of the media. He was never comfortable doing it. He went one time, never said anything else about doing it again, and never did it again.
The death of Larry Murphy was a devastating thing for John Dalton. The circumstances of that were very personal and were not related to politics.
Larry Murphy came from nothing, and he became somebody because everybody recognized that you had to go through Larry Murphy to get to John Dalton. In 1981, as the administration began to wind down, I think it was the Thanksgiving holiday. That night or the night after, at 1 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rings at my house. It is the head of the security detail who said, "Charlie, I've got some bad news for you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Larry has been involved in a fight, has shot some of the members of this girl's family, has shot her, and he has shot himself." And I said, "So is he okay?" And he said, "No, he's dead." And I said, "Thank you very much, CK," and hung the phone up. All of us were in a state of shock. And Dalton called and he said, "So what do you think?" And I said, "Well, Gov, this is just a tragedy. Of course, it had nothing to do with the office." He said, "Good, that's what we'll go with," and hung up the phone, which was his style. I went and saw the state health commissioner then and said, "Tell me how this could happen." And he said, "Charlie, it can happen to any of us." He said, "The human brain is like a lock, and if all the tumblers line up for just a split second, it can happen to any of us."
John was very fond of Larry Murphy. But Larry Murphy, he had his own problems like everybody does, I guess, and no one will ever know, what or why any of these things happened. As far as administration was concerned, it was a blow, but it didn't take long to recover.
I think John Dalton probably enjoyed being governor as much as anybody who's ever served. It was fun for him. It's what he had always wanted to do.
John Dalton was a person who solved problems, and I think problem-solving governor is what he was. I think that's the way he'll be remembered.
I think probably his biggest contribution was bringing a laser-like business mentality to the third floor.
He worked very hard. He worked very long hours. He traveled extensively around the state.
It was his job to be governor, but he enjoyed the hell out of it.
I was amazed with the complexity and the detail and the number of events that he was able to juggle, and he managed it also very well. And he did not show stress. He was a very even-keyed, high-energy, even-keyed person. It was a marvelous set of attributes to emulate.
John Dalton loved to go back to Radford as often as he could to work the farm. And I mean work the farm. And the troopers would come back after those weekend visits to Radford exhausted. And I said, why are you so tired? And they said, hell, we've been pitching hay and slopping cows and driving tractors all weekend.
He was definitely successful at whatever he undertook, but he put his whole heart in whatever he undertook.
He was always pitching in and doing more than his job required. He took on leadership positions with the National Governors Association, with the Southern Governors Association, with the Republican Governors Association, and John Dalton was a first-term governor. So it was quite a commendation, an unusual commendation of his leadership skills and what he was doing in Virginia that other governors admired and wanted his leadership.
John was on top of things, and he was, whether it was in business or whether it was in his life as a politician or governor or whatever.
John Dalton always kept his watch 10 minutes fast, so he would never be late for a meeting.
When his 4 years were complete, he had accomplished just about all that he wished to do.
Several times I would be in his office and he would pull out a pad from his desk where he had listed all the promises that he'd made, the things he said he would do in the '77 campaign, and he was still busily checking them off.
He planned it from the beginning, and he loved it. He loved every bit of it. I wondered when he left how he would feel. He joked that he lost his parking space and had to drive himself, but he was a very normal, humble person.
It was only after he went out of office that I remember him expressing the sentiment that that was the pinnacle of his political career, and that is all he wanted. He thought it was the highest honor to serve as Virginia's governor, and there wouldn't be any other office that could surpass that. I think he would tell you that if he were alive.
When you look at this state, it seems often as if it is such a Republican state. But the reality is that there is very strong two-party competition here. The fact that Republicans lost hold of state politics for a while, and the Democrats then came in and ran the state for the next 10 years, I think may say less about John Dalton than it says about Chuck Robb. Politics in that era had not become as driven by campaign consultants and by slogans as it is today.
I've thought that Governor Dalton, if he had been around to see some of the later decades changes in the Republican Party, would have been posing the question, is this in the best interest of the long-term health of the Republican Party in Virginia? Is this the way that we're going to maintain a majority appeal to our voters? Is this the way that we're going to be able to come together on the issues? The bitterness is the aspect that he mostly would have objected to as unnecessary and negative and not putting us in the direction that we needed to go for success. He was very positively focused.
I'm not sure that he enjoyed the way the political arena evolved after his departure. It's not enough today to defeat an opponent. It's important to bury the opponent, and I don't think that that bodes well for good, wholesome, positive leadership in the future.
When I think about the day I heard about his death, the thought I had was that vibrancy just shut down. Hard to deal with.
I don't need to tell you how badly we need another Virginia Republican in the United States Senate.
This was my time, and I had been around the track as a lieutenant governor in '73, so it was my race to run in '77.
He and I were being interviewed about the Republican Party history. John had been declared terminally ill. He knew he was going to die, and I knew he was going to die. He was healthy in outward appearances. He was alert. And to have to reflect backwards and be aware, well, you were in it in the past, but you're not going to be in it in the future, was a very difficult personal experience for me, and I expect for him.
I had in mind a lifetime goal of being governor, but I felt I was a young man and didn't have to hurry it up.
You had your program planned.
I had my program planned. It was going to be there somewhere.
But it enhanced my respect for him
They had me at
and my love for him, and I really did have a love for John, though I differed with him on some items as I've indicated.
John's whole political life, I think, came about because he loved his father, Ted Dalton. I think John thought in some way the carry on through himself was important. And so I think the father-son team, if I had to put my finger on one reason why he dedicated his life to political life, it would be that, for his father, Ted Dalton.
Production funding for No Higher Honor was provided in part by a grant from the law firm of McGuire Woods. Whether assisting a Fortune 500 corporation or a startup company, McGuire Woods' objective is unwavering, a dedication to client service that exceeds all expectations.